Hi, this is Prophet from down south behind enemy lines, and you're listening to Two Broads Talking Politics.
Are you listening?
Hey everyone, this is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. We have the return of my co-host Sophy. Hey Sophy.
Hey Kelly, glad to be back, although I do have kind of a cold, so excuse my gravelly voice.
Either way, I'm thrilled to have you back. And tonight we are joined by Joe Sanberg. Joe is an entrepreneur and investor, and we'll talk a little bit more about why he's on this show. So hi Joe.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining us. So, Joe, maybe you could just give everybody a little bit of background about who you are, and then we'll talk more about some of the things you've been working on, but just to sort of get a sense of who you are.
Sure. Well, I'm a progressive entrepreneur, and my passion is to end poverty. I grew up in a low-income household. My mom raised me by herself, and we even lost our home to foreclosure when I was a teenager. And what that experience really instilled in me from a young age is that this idea that if you work hard and play by the rules, everything's going to work out okay isn't true. My mom couldn't have worked any harder, and things didn't work out okay for her. She still lost her home to foreclosure. And I've been passionate about trying to rectify the problems in our economy right now that are just leaving so many people living on the edge, paycheck to paycheck.
So what are some of the things you've been doing? I know you've had a couple of projects that you've been working on, things that you worked on in California, and then also some of the other stuff that you've been doing.
Well, I focus on really two different areas of trying to create change. First is building businesses that are based on progressive values that deliver things that people need to make their lives better. And then in my activism life, I've been focused on helping organizing communities to make sure that low-income people get their earned income tax credit. So in my entrepreneur life, my biggest focus has been as co-founder of Aspiration.com. Aspiration.com is an online financial institution for values-driven consumers who want to match their money and their beliefs. And the biggest reason people come to Aspiration.com is to get the socially conscious banking account that Aspiration delivers, which helps you get great banking services, but also having the peace of mind of knowing that your money isn't lent out to fossil fuel companies or gun companies or private prison companies, which is what happens if you put your money at many of the big banks. And then in my activism life, about 4 years ago, I started a nonprofit to advocate for the California Earned Income Tax Credit. And when we got California to create an Earned Income Tax Credit, then we launched a community organizing program that now serves almost 2 million low-income Californians every single year with free tax prep and organizing that makes sure they get their earned income tax credit. Recently, we expanded that earned income tax credit organizing around the country and launched under the Working Hero banner similar efforts in Iowa and South Carolina.
That's great. So I think that one of the things that a lot of us who are progressive activists tend to think is like, you know, there's this divide between capitalism and what we want to accomplish, and that there aren't good ways to sort of bridge that gap. But it sounds like you're taking sort of a different approach.
Well, I think that these monikers create artificial boundaries. The reality is our economy has been a mixed economy for a long time. And it'll probably be a mixed economy for a long time to come. There's some parts of it that are based on free market capitalism and other parts of it that are socialistic. The problem right now, though, is that we have socialism for big monopolies and lobbyists and free market, you're on your own capitalism for all the rest of us. And it's the distribution of where we have the free market capitalism and where we have the socialism that needs to be recalibrated.
Can you tell us a little bit more about Aspiration? I know you had mentioned that you can have you can choose your fee for the checking account. Can you tell us a little bit more about how that operates?
Sure. Well, it operates just like you described. The only fees you pay at Aspiration.com are the voluntary fees you choose to pay. And it's part of a model called Pay What's Fair. And what Aspiration is trying to fix is that most people have a relationship with their bank where the worse they do, the better their bank does, right? At the times your balances are lowest, your bank charges you the highest fees. And aspiration really flips the script on that into a different kind of relationship where you're only paying aspiration if you're so happy that you'll voluntarily pay. The second part of aspiration that's really unique is matching your money and your values. Millions of us are passionate about the climate crisis or the crisis of gun violence. There are a lot of people who are passionate about justice in those frontiers, yet have their money at banks that use their funds to make loans to fossil fuel companies or gun companies. And aspirations bank accounts are restricted from using customer money to lend to fossil fuel gun companies and prison companies. Plus, Aspiration built this really cool feature called the Aspiration Impact Measurement, which is the scoring system that shows you how the places where you spend money on your aspiration card treat their workers and the environment. So imagine you use your aspiration card at a local pharmacy like CVS. In the Aspiration app, you'll see a people score and a planet score assigned to CVS for how CVS treats its workers and the environment. Then you can click on a tab to see how other pharmacies score for how they treat their workers and the environment. And that's special to the Aspiration app. And it's a way that Aspiration makes it easier for people in the Aspiration community to match their social values and their money.
Do you think that there are any lessons from that particular business model of pay what you feel, moved to pay that we can apply to the workings of our government?
Well, I think that we have to center in every organization and in every movement the people that need help. And so in the case of Aspiration's Pay What's Fair model, it centers the needs of Aspiration customers. An analogy would be ways that we can better center the way our government operates to the needs of voters. And so you can imagine the different kinds of structural changes that might be involved with that to make sure that the government is responsive to voters, not special interests.
So one of the things you talk about in your website is that you were able to get financial aid to go to Harvard, and that made a big difference in being able to get that kind of education. Have you thought more broadly about that piece of it? That, we're talking a lot in this moment right now. Elizabeth Warren has plans for college debt and free college, and that's was a big piece of Bernie Sanders' campaign. What do you think sort of a conscientious model of helping people get college education, to have that support that you had would look like on a larger scale?
Well, so many factors are intersecting here. First of all, it's really hard for people to get a lot out of college when they've been saddled with years and years and years of poverty and bad education. And so we can't separate the question of education from the question of poverty. When kids are going to school hungry, when kids' parents or perhaps their mom work 3 jobs and have no time to spend with the kids, it's harder to become as well educated. So one of the big mission points of improving educational outcomes is to change the nature of the economy so that everyone who's working can afford life's basic needs, instead of the current situation where most people who are working have to work multiple jobs and they still can't afford life's basic needs. Then I think there's the question of containing college costs. It's insane how college costs have inflated so far in excess of actual inflation in the economy. And this is an area where the government ought to use its leverage, because remember, the government gives lots of money to institutions of higher education. Well, institutions of higher education that want government funds ought to commit to limiting the inflation of their tuition costs. Another area of mission here is we, in my view, should forgive all government student debt, period. And it would be the most accelerating, freeing thing we could do for our economy. It wouldn't just be great for the people who are saddled with college debt. It would be great for all the businesses and home builders and tourist companies and auto manufacturers that aren't receiving as much demand as they could receive if so many millions of potential customers weren't saddled with $1 trillion of government debt. We think about government debt and the government as this distant body. But in reality, when $1 trillion is owed in student debt, it's just really owed to all of us, right? Because we're the government, we're the taxpayers. And so if we totally wiped out that $1 trillion of government-owed student debt, it wouldn't be that we'd be causing that $1 trillion to vanish. Rather, that $1 trillion would get re-shifted to other places in the economy. And so instead of the tens of millions of people who owe that debt using their excess earnings to pay it off, they'd use their excess earnings to buy homes, go on vacation, spend more on education, buy cars, into productive activities that have what's called a multiplier effect and create more jobs along the way. Instead, though, right now we've condemned like near 40 million people into just paying back this unproductive debt that just goes back into government coffers.
So I think you've basically already answered this question, but since people are saying it, I'm going to ask it. There are people who say that if we erase student loan debt, that would be somehow unfair to people who've already paid their loans off, people who paid their loans off more quickly. How would you respond to something like that?
I think it's absurd. I think it's like saying that people who had polio would be upset that we cured polio for the next generation and that the next generation wasn't going to have polio. There's a small number of people who might feel off-put by a massive initiative of student debt forgiveness, but I think most people who've gone through the struggle and suffering of having to work multiple jobs to pay off their student debt don't find joy in others facing that same struggle. They find joy in knowing that their struggle was for a greater good and that the next generation of borrowers didn't have to go through the same turmoil that they went through.
Yeah, I've been saying it's like saying we should never make progress. Should never make progress because it's not fair to the people who didn't have that progress.
Correct.
So there was a quote in the San Francisco Chronicle from a political advisor of yours saying that you were being urged to run for president. Are you considering a political run in the near future?
Well, I'm always thinking about the ways that I can best serve, and I think that's what all of us have to do. I think that the meaning of life is doing everything we can with the talents we have to help others and make the world better. And I think the way we can serve changes at different points in our life. And I'm always evaluating whether running for office is a way I can serve, continuing being an activist is a way I can serve, and everything in between.
So on the political front, you just went to South Dakota, which is, not a traditional stop for people who are thinking about running for president. So you were in South Dakota with the South Dakota Democrats. So can you talk a little bit about the speech that you gave there? And it was, right after the tragic shooting this weekend. And I know you talked about that as well.
I did. It's easier to talk about happier things. But if we don't talk about and continue to call out the coordinated assault by white supremacists against so many Americans, Jews, Muslims, African Americans, Latinos, members of the LGBTQIA community, women, low-income Americans, if we don't keep calling it out, we will become numb to it. And it's when we become numb to it that the white supremacists win. And it's, in fact, in part because we became complacent over the last couple of decades that the white supremacists rose. Everyone needs to hear this message, and South Dakota especially has to hear this message. We're not going to fight back the tide of white supremacy unless we fight back from California to New York, and it has to also occur in places like South Dakota.
What are some of the ways, I think it's important to call it out, but I suspect it's going to take a lot more than that to sort of bring people back together and help people see each other as humans again, which I think has been part of driving this problem. What are some of the ways you think that we can sort of help, stem this tide of white supremacist violence and shootings and really get back to a place where Americans can feel safe?
Well, I think we ought to ban gun ownership. And I think there's going to come a time in our future where the call to ban gun ownership will have been obvious. I know that right now it sounds like an audacious suggestion, but sadly, I believe that nothing is going to change until we take some kind of audacious move like that. Lots of developed countries in the world have banned gun ownership. And in years past, centuries past, a lot of things were the case that aren't the case now. And as time passes, we hope, as humans, we evolve and improve. And I don't think that there's a need for gun ownership in 2019 America. And I think there's going to be even less of a need for gun ownership in decades to come. Would I settle for something short of banning gun ownership? I sure would. But as a negotiating position, as progressives, we've fallen so short of what you do when you're a good negotiator. You know, conservatives, their negotiating place is no rules on gun ownership. And then they settle for some kind of compromise. Whereas as progressives, we always negotiate from our position of compromise instead of our position of aspiration. And my position of aspiration and hope on guns is that we should have a future where there is no gun ownership. That's from where we ought to negotiate with conservatives.
I'm all for it.
Well, I think so are tens of millions of other Americans. I think when you poll the question, like so many other questions in polling, you're limited by what people think is possible. And we've conditioned people to think that a future where there's no gun ownership is implausible and unrealistic. And so people are afraid to even acknowledge that that's what they want. And where we've fallen short as progressives, until recently, with great new leaders like AOC, is we haven't expanded people's understanding of what's possible. We haven't made people uncomfortable by pushing on the edges of what could be. And that's been AOC's one of AOC's greatest triumphs, is expanding our imagination of what's possible. And I think we can do that in the question of guns too. We ought to show people that it's possible we can have a future with no gun ownership, and that'd be the safest future.
So speaking of AOC, one of the things she talks about a lot, of course, is the Green New Deal. And I've seen you speaking some about that too. Can you talk about sort of your thoughts about the Green New Deal? And I'm thinking sort of from the perspective of an entrepreneur. You know, I think the part that's not talked about with that a lot is sort of the ramp up in industry and building infrastructure.
The Green New Deal would be one of the surest, most tremendous boosts to our economy since World War II. And we've been talking and bemoaning about the fact that the economy hasn't been able to achieve and sustain 3 or 4% GDP growth, the kind of GDP growth that really gets wages going. And yet, so many business people thumb their nose at the surest way to get that kind of GDP growth. To grow GDP at a fast clip that increases wages, you have to have major industrial policy that invests in new industries. And the biggest opportunity we have to make a huge investment in American industry is in the Green New Deal. The Green New Deal is just one of the biggest no-brainers in the last 100 years of American public policy. First of all, we have a moral urgency to implement the Green New Deal. Otherwise, our kids aren't going to have a planet that's inhabitable. But beyond the question of whether our planet is inhabitable, you have the opportunity of all of the industrial investment and job growth and investment in marginalized communities that have been most victimized by institutional racism and institutional misogyny that we can get right with the Green New Deal. So I'm so excited about it because it makes sense from every angle. It makes sense for what's right in the heart. It makes sense for what's smart to the head. And it makes sense for what's compelling to the wallet. What I've seen about business and entrepreneurship from my personal experiences is that you have to invest in innovation and new industry if you want to grow the economy. And for decades, we've been investing at the margin. And here with the Green New Deal, we finally have the opportunity to unlock the kind of massive investment and much bigger growth that we did when we were fighting World War II. Instead, this time, we're not fighting the Nazis. We're fighting for the future of our planet and ensuring it's inhabitable for our kids.
you obviously have much more communication with other people in the entrepreneurial world than we do, for instance. Do you think that this is something that would be popular? We talk a lot about sort of big companies as being, sort of almost the enemy to progress. There's like, oh, well, the activists want Democrats to win and big companies with lobbyists want Republicans to win. And I suspect it's nowhere near that cut and dry. But do you think that something like the Green New Deal is something that could have sort of broad support?
Well, the problem actually is that there's some Democrats who want big corporations with lobbyists to win too.
Sure.
And it's a combination of Republicans and some Democrats that have created this monopoly economy we have, where a smaller and smaller number of humongous corporations with big lobbyists create rules for themselves that we don't even know about. And then all of the rest of us are playing by this other set of rules that the big monopolies with lobbyists thumb their noses at. So the question isn't what the big monopolies with lobbyists think about the Green New Deal. The question is what the Green New Deal would do for all of the entrepreneurs and small and medium-sized businesses that really make up the backbone of the economy. We need to rectify the fact that big monopolies have way too much power over our economy. And as Democrats for 40 years now, we've fallen short of administering the kind of antitrust agenda that our economy requires. But for the small and medium-sized business owners and entrepreneurs, the Green New Deal provided that we implemented it in a way that didn't extend all of the disadvantages that our current monopoly economy imposes on small and medium-sized businesses. It would be a huge boon for the formation of new small and medium-sized businesses, create all kinds of new opportunities for them in a variety of sectors, from construction to solar and technology and software. And it's an opportunity for us to get right what we've gotten wrong over the last 40 years and distribute that new growth the Green Deal would stimulate more broadly across all kinds of stakeholders instead of just big monopolies.
Could you talk a little bit about the earned income tax credit and the way it's worked in California? I think that it's a term I've heard, but not something I know very much about or how it would help.
You bet. Well, the earned income tax credit is a cashback tax credit you get when you file taxes and earn a low income. So imagine you earn $20,000 a year. You don't even owe taxes. You'd still get the earned income tax credit, probably a couple $1,000s depending on how many kids you have. And so what the earned income tax credit does is literally make your work pay better. The problem with it, though, is that you have to file a tax return to get it. And for very low income people who don't owe any taxes, it's not obvious they have to file a tax return. And as a result, every single year, there's $15 billion of earned income tax credits that are unclaimed by people who could get it. Think about that, $15 billion. Over 7.5 years, that's $100 billion of earned income tax credits that low-income people don't claim. And let's talk about who those low-income people are. Primarily, they're single moms. Over 2 out of 3 earned income tax credit dollars go to low-income women. And where the gender wage gap is most pernicious but least discussed is how low-income women earn even less than their low-income male peers. You hear so much about the gender wage gap around female executives who don't earn as much as their male peers, and obviously that has to be rectified. But where the gender wage gap is literally a matter of 3 or 2 meals a day for kids is among low-income workers. And so the EITC is so compelling because it's literally raising the wages of low-income women.
And so you had helped to found a outreach program called Cal EITC for Me that was going to help families try to claim that tax credit. Can you talk a little bit about what that does?
Well, Cal EITC for Me makes sure that every low-income Californian who's eligible for the earned income tax credit knows about it, gets free tax prep services, and gets it. And as a result of our work, we've helped over 2 million low-income Californians get over $4 billion of earned income tax credits they otherwise wouldn't have gotten because they don't have a requirement to file a tax return since their income is so low. And so our work has really been the focus of my activism life. And what we've achieved is the greatest source of gratification in my life. And we've changed the lives of so many millions of Californians who are able to provide 3 meals a day instead of 2 meals a day to their kids, who are able to stay in their apartments and avoid eviction. I mean, these are the stakes of getting people their earned income tax credit.
And you said you're now expanding that to a few other states?
That's right. So this year we launched our work in Iowa and South Carolina under the banner of Working Hero. So we have a Working Hero Iowa led by J.D. Schulten, and we have a Working Hero South Carolina led by Renita Jameson.
That's great. And J.D. Schulten, of course, ran for Congress, and I believe he was with you in South Dakota or introduced you to the people in South Dakota.
He sure was with me in South Dakota. That's right.
Yeah. And so if people would like to know more about the things you're working on and maybe help out with some of these projects, how can they learn a little bit more about you?
First of all, if people want to learn more about what we're doing, please follow me on Twitter at Joseph N. Sanberg and send me a direct message, and I'll answer any questions you have. My direct messages are open. Also, you can check out workinghero.org and learn more about what we're doing throughout the country to help people get their earned income tax credit.
All right. Excellent. We'll put links up on our website, too, so people can find that more easily. So, Joe, thank you so much for talking to us. This has been really a great conversation. I love hearing about these kinds of projects, and it really forces me to think a little bit more about what's possible. I think, I don't know about Sophie, but I've had a real sort of like eat the rich kind of mentality lately.
Yes.
And
well, that's a good reason.
Yeah, but I think it's really important to think about ways that we can eradicate poverty without, just making everybody give up all their wealth.
Well, hope to see you in person sometime.
Yeah. If you're ever in the Midwest, we're all over the Midwest.
I'm in the Midwest often, so I'm sure I'll see you soon.
Awesome.
Thanks for listening to Two Broads Talking Politics. Our theme song is called Are You Listening? Off of the album Elephant-Shaped Trees by the band Immunuri, and we're using it with permission of the band. Our logo and other original artwork is by Matthew Wethlin and was created for use by this podcast.